You know, when I was asked to do this, and I'm sure Barry wrestled with the same issues, how do you describe a person's life in 30 minutes or less? So I'm going to use a lot of pictures and just kind of fill in. So my grandfather was Bishop Harold Jones. As I matured in life and thought back about my grandfather, much like Bishop Walter, I thought of my grandfather as Christ's humble servant. And that was a trait shared by both of the Jones boys. Go ahead and do the slide if you would. Trying to break it up a little bit, and I'll try to touch on each one of the parts of my grandfather's life and try to hit the highlights. Grandpa was also a Christmas baby, which is, I think, no small irony. He was born December 24th, not the 25th. So Grandpa was also cheated out of having birthday and Christmas. He was born in Mitchell. His mother died shortly after the birth of his younger brother, Kenneth, and his dad disappeared. So Grandpa was an orphan. He was raised by his mother's parents, William Holmes and Rebecca Holmes. His grandfather, William Holmes, was an Episcopal priest. So he had an early grounding in the faith. His early childhood was spent in Niobrara, Nebraska, and Wapala, South Dakota. These were very happy years for him. He spoke very warmly of his childhood. He and his brother being raised by their grandparents. He said it was almost a storybook childhood. Then Grandpa Holmes died when Grandpa was in his teens. And I think the church pension program has come a long way since then, because all they were able to afford them was $40 a month in pension, which even back in those days was not very much. However, Grandpa was able to go to college. He graduated from Northern State University in Aberdeen, and was encouraged by others in the missionary district of South Dakota, including the bishop, to attend Seabury Western Seminary in Chicago, where Father Rich went, ironically. Oh, and he disappeared. Especially at his grandmother's behest, he finished seminary, and he graduated in 1938. One thing, when I think about my grandfather, physically, I think he was an unremarkable man. But he had charisma. He could light up a room, and you could never put your finger on it. Growing up with Ronald Reagan as president and his communication style, I saw a great deal of similarity between the two. He just was able to make a connection with people, whether it be one-on-one or in a large group. He never acknowledged this gift. He never thought he was good enough, which is ironic. Go ahead and do a new slide, please. So, his ordination and early ministry. This is Grandpa's first church, which some of you may have seen. This is Christ Church at Red Shirt Table. And just to the left of the church, I don't have a photo of that, was their honeymoon cottage. It was a little one-room cabin with, you know, Grandma often said she didn't quite know what she got herself into when she married. When he was ordained in 1938 in December, Grandma and Grandpa were married 5 days later. And that's when they ended up at Red Shirt Table. He was then ordained a priest in 1941, and my mother was born also in 1941. And that was her first home. They had 2 children that died in infancy, 2 boys. My brother and I were twins. Grandpa always talked about how apparently they weren't ready to raise 2 boys, but he felt that my parents ended up with their 2 boys. So they had a strong affinity for my brother and me. He went on to become the superintending presbyter as they called it back then, of the Pine Ridge Mission the Cheyenne River Mission in 1947, and then in 1952, he moved back to Pine Ridge to be superintendent presbyter. Go ahead and change the slide, please. Then he moved away from South Dakota. Oh, I should add at that time, he had a deep, deep connection with the diocese. Wonderful relationship with the bishop, and a strong interest in interracial relations. He didn't view himself as an Indian priest. He viewed himself as a priest for the church to minister to all. And they actually did some of that up at Cheyenne River. It was quite an integrated society there at Old Cheyenne Agency. Gotta check time. In 1956, he was called to serve Trinity Church in Wapaton, North Dakota, which is primarily a white congregation. They never thought of him as an Indian priest. He never thought of them as a white congregation. They were a congregation. And they had a wonderful time there. While they were there, Grandma worked at the Indian school in Wapaton. And along the way, there was a deep bond formed between Harold and Walter Jones from a very early age. Marilyn can tell us more about this, but they were part of each other's lives from an early time. I think a precursor of things to come. Go ahead and change the slide, please. In 1968, I found this picture online. Beautiful place. I remember going here when I was young. In 1968, the National Church asked my grandfather to go to the Navajo Land Area Mission and be in charge at Good Shepherd Mission in Fort Defiance, Arizona. Wonderful, wonderful place, especially in the wintertime. Barry talked about his father in the election for bishop. And during that special convention, actually my grandparents were in town here visiting us. And my dad talked my grandfather into going with him to the convention. And I'm not sure why, but there was a huge snowstorm and they weren't able to go. There were some attempts to place my grandfather's name on the ballot for that convention, and he resisted those attempts. He instead wanted to support his longtime friend Walter. And I'm afraid it could have damaged the relationship if they would have ended up going. And so I think God intervened. I'll go ahead and change slides, please. As I mentioned, Grandpa was very resistant to have his name placed into consideration for bishop. He never aspired for that office. But Bishop Walter did call for a suffragan bishop in 1971, and he asked that, if at all possible, that this bishop be an Indian person. And so my grandfather reluctantly agreed to do that. They were very happy in Arizona. He had a great ministry there. All their needs were taken care of. So in 1971, my grandfather was elected suffragan bishop to work for Bishop Walter and work with Bishop Walter. Change the slide, please. It's a little blurry, but this is shortly after the election, and these are the bishops of North and South Dakota. Grandfather's on the right. You can see that handsome man hunched over. That's Bishop Walter. And the one on the left is Bishop George Masuda from North Dakota. And the lovely woman in the middle is my grandmother. She was always in the middle of things. Change slides, please. Grandpa was consecrated in 1972 at St. Joseph's Cathedral in Sioux Falls, the Roman Catholic Cathedral. You can see him kneeling there at the laying on of hands. I remember that very well. I was only 7 years old. But when important things happen to you at a young age, if you do remember them. And I was deathly sick. I had 102 fever, and my mom was thinking of hiring a babysitter to stay with me, but my grandmother insisted that I go. She said, he's tough, he can make it, it's important for him to be there. I knew then that it was a special event. Change slides, please. Here's another shot. Bishop Walter on the left and Grandpa in the center. This is when they're vesting him. Next one. And celebrating the Eucharist, the two Jones boys behind the altar. I didn't see this at the time, but the church made a recording of events during that day. And there was a television interview towards the end where the commentator, the interviewer, I don't remember who it was, asked my grandfather what it felt like to be the first native bishop. And he said that, when I was elected, I didn't realize that I was the first native bishop. But he said something profound that really spoke to me, and it apparently spoke to the people that put the movie together because they used that tagline. And his quote was, others will follow. So, and others have. Go ahead and change the slide. I found some quotes from Father Ron Hennies from when my grandfather died that I think lay things out pretty well. According to Father Hennies, Grandpa lived the Native American concept of generosity. He'd literally give you the shirt off his back and he'd never check to see if he had a spare. He brought many of the characteristics of the best of Native American culture with him to this Christian expression. And he went on to say, he was a fine mentor and a fine man. He didn't get out to be the best I could produce by bawling me out or laying out goals and all that. He did it by modeling, humble and generous and gospel-oriented in the best sense of the word. I never wanted to shortchange that man. My grandfather, would you skip ahead?
I thought,
I'm going to cut your pay. Grandfather was fiercely loyal to Bishop Walter in his vision for the diocese. The two collaborated on a great deal of initiatives. Grandpa was never one to put his stamp on it. His place was to support his friend, Walter Jones. The two were nearly inseparable and took every opportunity to be together and to be the bishops for South Dakota. And it wasn't all honey and roses back then either. The two of them had to watch out for each other's backs quite a bit. Probably not the same controversies we have today, but it was important to both of them that they ministered to both Indian and white congregations. And this did cause some hard feelings among some of the reservation churches. Some of the reservation churches felt, okay, we have an Indian bishop, we don't need to have a white bishop here anymore. Well, the Jones boys had different plans. Frequently, Walter Jones would be the one to go to the reservations, and Grandpa would be the one to go to the white congregations, because they didn't want them to be known as one bishop for whites, one bishop for Indians. They wanted to be known as bishops. As Walter Jones was, Grandpa was a strong believer in youth ministry. I have fond memories of my early visits to Thunderhead Episcopal Camp. Of course, I was way too young to be a camper, but Grandma and Grandpa would go up there frequently and got to know the place pretty well. He fully supported the building of the new camp and the move across the highway, which a lot of us as campers, we mourned. We mourned that because change is hard even for kids, but it's a wonderful place now. And I ran across some photos that were really hard to take off the internet, but there's some photos of the service dedicating the new camp which shows both of the Bishop Jones there celebrating. Go ahead and change slides, please. In 1972, Grandpa suffered a stroke, and let's see, lost my page. Yeah. He suffered a stroke in 72. This did affect his physical ministry. In 1976, as a result of the effects of that stroke, he just felt he couldn't give the diocese full time anymore. And so Bishop Walter agreed to allow Grandpa to retire. We found it wasn't a leisurely retirement, however. Whenever Bishop Walter would need help, Grandpa was there to help. He was always eager to, as long as his body would allow him. I remember growing up, Walter and Marilyn were frequent guests at Grandma and Grandpa's house. We got to know them very well. We got to know their kids very well, although the closest one in age to me was Kristen. All these others just stopped hearing these irritating kids that ran. Now they like us. But I think that was important. It's an important part of my own upbringing and an important example of the type of ministry that the Joneses had with each other. When Bishop Walter ended up moving back to Canada to become Bishop of Rupert's Land, that left the diocese without a bishop, so Grandpa had to step in 1983, and I was actually quite amazed. He'd actually fairly well recovered from the effects of his stroke. He was in much better health in his later years than he was in his 60s. So he stepped up the activity, and he functioned basically as a diocesan for a short time. Go ahead and change the slides. It's not a real good picture, but that's Bishop Craig Anderson. When he was elected bishop, they had a false start. They had a diocesan convention to elect a bishop, and it ended in deadlock. And things didn't turn out well. And my grandfather intervened, and he had this way of teaching you a lesson gently. And I don't think that was one of those days. I think he actually lost his temper a bit with the convention, told them they needed to find a bishop and find one now because he's tired. So he helped create consensus, and they found Bishop Craig Anderson. Most of all, Grandpa loved his child, his grandchildren, and his great-grandchildren. I'll give you a taste of a photo. Go ahead and change the slides. That's my brother's wedding here at Emmanuel. I know it's a little blurry, but this was in 1984. Yeah, Grandma and Grandpa were a handsome couple even back then. Grandpa prided himself on baptizing, confirming, and marrying his grandchildren, and baptizing his great-grandchildren. And I think he had it in just about all of them. Grandpa continued to be active in the diocese until 1989 when my grandmother died. This broke his heart. Those two were very, very, very close, very tight. Just like Barry said, behind every good priest is a good woman, and Grandma was that good woman. And she kept him centered. You know, Grandpa was a visionary. Grandma was the realist. I remember hearing, "Come now, Harold, come on. You know what reality is." And so she would keep him centered. He started spending winters with my parents after Grandma died. Change slides, please. But the activity didn't stop. I remember I took him to this event in Los Angeles where they consecrated the suffragan bishop. And over here, this here, that was Barbara Harris, the first female bishop in the church. Here's Grandpa. and he introduced me to Bishop Corrigan here, who is of some notoriety in that he was one of the ones who ordained women priests illegally and was punished for it. But they were good friends. Grandpa very much disagreed with him in many things. But as an example, he always got along with his fellow bishops for the sake of the church. Something that's missing now. Go ahead and change slides. He even ventured to Washington Cathedral in 1992 for the 500-year celebration of Columbus discovering America. There are, flanking the presiding bishop there's two native bishops on each side. Just to Grandpa's left, Grandpa's on the far left, and to his left, Stephen Plummer from the Navajo land. Who Grandpa had a great influence on him at Good Shepherd Mission. And Stephen Plummer went on to become confirmed, went on to seminary, became a priest, and eventually the bishop of Navajo. Great man. I really enjoyed knowing him as a young child. Change slides, please. And here he is at the consecration of Creighton Robertson in 1994. It was almost as miserable hot that day as it was when your dad was consecrated. I remember that well. There might be a photo or two you're sending around if you passed out at your dad's consecration. Grandpa was especially proud when Creighton Robertson was elected bishop because he was one of my grandfather's acolytes at the Trinity Church in Washington. 1995, Grandpa moved permanently to Arizona where he was able to just be Grandpa. Or change slides. We had a celebration here for him at Emmanuel. I don't know who that ugly guy in the center is, but Grandpa's on the left and Bishop Robertson's on the right, and you can't read what's on the cake, but it's basically saying farewell. If you change slides, please. There's two old friends at the farewell party. Grandpa, just like Bishop Alter, was very close to John Kurovich, who many of you know here. You know, when Grandpa turned 90, I'm running out of time. When Grandpa turned 90, that was quite a milestone. So I said, Grandpa, how does it feel to be 90 years old? And he thought for a minute, like he always does, and he says, well, grandson, at my age, every day is a bonus. And so he truly lived his life as a bonus, and I think he was a gift from God. Would you change slides, please? I found this photo in a box in the house, and I thought it was quite appropriate. This is the last photo, I think, of the two of them together. This is in my parents' driveway in Chandler, Arizona. I think it might have been their birthday celebration, because I think we were there for Christmas. And they shared a birthday. You know, as Indian people, we have a belief in some mysticism. Back in Easter of 2002, my son Justin and I, sitting back there on the counter, you should be sitting on the counter. We were scheduled to go to Arizona for Easter, and this is ironic, but we had a very early morning flight and had to be up at about 4 o'clock. And I forgot to set the alarm. But we didn't oversleep. You know, my grandmother haunts people. And I remember her coming to me in a dream. And I remember her very clearly saying, Tim, get up. It's time to go see your grandfather. It's going to be the last time you see him. And I woke up in a cold sweat, and I looked at the clock, and I thought, oh my God, this is when I'm supposed to be up. So I went to turn off the alarm. It wasn't set. So, weird. She had this happen. She hasn't haunted me since Grandpa died. Grandpa died November 12th of 2002. I think it's no small irony that circumstances allowed Archbishop Walter Jones to be the celebrant at his funeral. Bishop Robertson was here in town and fell deathly ill. And Bishop Walter was scheduled to preach, but in the end, he was the celebrant as well. So I think it was a fitting tribute and a testament to the bond between those two men that we've all, in our families, have come to know. And I think those of us in the diocese have come to know. So I think both of them, the spirits of both men, they will live on in our hearts and minds, and they will have a lasting impact on this diocese for years to come. So with that, I'm done. You want to tell a story?
Yeah.
Marilyn wants to tell a story. I'll bring it over. When Grandma Marilyn talks, people listen. I learned that at a young age.
This little story is very short, but it'll let you know what Bishop Harold was really like. We always stayed with them when we came to the hills. And our youngest daughter, Kristen, who's not here, came to me one morning after breakfast, and Harold always made the porridge. And it was a kind of stand-up porridge.
Cream of wheat. Good stuff.
Or oatmeal.
Yeah.
Anyhow, she said, "Mother, can I be excused from breakfast prayers?" And I said, "Honey, you'll have to ask Bishop Harold that." I said, "Why do you want to be excused from bishop prayers, morning prayers?" And she said, "Mother, Bishop Harold prays for everybody he's ever met in his whole life." And those prayers go on and on so long, and I can hardly sit through them. So if I could be excused, I'd like that.
Well, we tried to be excused a few times. It didn't work out so good.
Would it be out of line for me to say just 2 lines?
Oh, no.
I don't mean to interrupt. I apologize for being late. The tape is wrong. They always are. I'll just yell. It's going to be short because you don't. Some people don't know. I have a terrible memory. In my teen years, Bishop Walter was my minister in Mitchell, South Dakota, St. Mary's Episcopal Church. And he was the most inspirational person in my life. He took us on a canoe trip. Okay, she's holding me. He took our scout troop, he was a scout leader on a canoe trip to Flin Flon. And it's always been sort of a special place. I've never been back there. My son and I were planning to drive our motorcycle to Flin Flon this year. He had to have a baby, so we decided not to go next year. But what he did on that canoe trip, and I know what we should have planned, as we were paddling canoes up by Flin Flon, and I was a young teen, instead of casual, and Bishop, he was father, I fathered him. I was in the bow of the boat, he was in the middle of the boat. He said a poem that meant a lot to